Hello listeners, this video will discuss Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Charlotte Bronte was an English novelist and poet. She was born in the year 1816 and died in the year 1855. Bronte was the eldest of three Bronte sisters. The three sisters are Charlotte herself, Emily and Annie. Bronte sisters, they were a 19th century literary family. All three sisters are well-known poets and novelists, especially Emily's work Wuthering Heights and Annie's work The Tenant of Wildfell Hall are the most accepted masterpieces of literature. Bronte's first novel, The Professor, was rejected by the publishers. Jane Eyre was her second novel, which was published in 1847. The Bronte sisters, they use a pseudonym called Belle when they publish their works. Her notable works include The Professor, Jane Eyre, Shirley, Villette. Villette is her third novel, which was the last novel published in her lifetime. Let us see an outline of the novel Jane Eyre. The novel was published by an English writer, Charlotte Bronte. It was published under her pen name Currer Bell on 19th October 1847 by Smith, Elder and Co. of London. The novel Jane Eyre takes the genre of Bildungsroman, which means it focuses on the psychological and moral growth of the protagonist from childhood to adulthood. So the novel follows the experiences of the heroine. It includes her growth to adulthood and it moves on to look into her love life for Mr. Rochester, who is the brooding master of Thornfield Hall. The novel White Sargasso Sea is a 1966 novel which was written by Dominican British author Jean Rhys. White Sargasso Sea is the prequel to Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre. The summary and notes of White Sargasso Sea is given in the description box. So the novel by Jean Rhys, she describes the background of Mr. Rochester's marriage from the viewpoint of his wife Antoinette Causeway. She is a Creole heiress. Jean Rhys has taken the characters for White Sargasso Sea from the novel Jane Eyre by Bronte. The novel contains the elements of social criticism along with Christian morality. The main protagonist of the novel, Jane Eyre, she experiences the core idea of class, sexuality, religion, and feminism. Jane Eyre is also a romantic novel. So, along with Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, this is also one of the most famous romantic novels. The novel has 38 chapters. This lecture has the whole summary of the novel. Let us see the characters of Jane Eyre. The protagonist Jane Eyre, she is a narrator and she is an orphaned girl who is caught between class boundaries, financial situations and her conflicted feelings. She becomes a governess at Thornfield Hall. Jane is passionate and she is principled in her life. She values freedom and independence. When the novel began, she was at age 10. And when the main narrative ends, she was at 19 or 20. Edward Fairfax Rochester, who is the wealthy master of Thornfield Hall and the employer of Jane, who later becomes her husband. St. John Rivers, he is a parson. Parson means a clergy. He has two sisters at Moor House and he is Jane's cousin. Bertha Mason, who is Rochester's insane Creole wife from Jamaica. She was locked away on the third floor of Thornfield. She is portrayed as less human. Adele Warrens, who is Jane's young pupil at Thornfield. Selin Warrens, who is Adeline's mother. Blanche Ingram, who is a beautiful socialite who wants to marry Mr. Rochester. Rosamond Oliver, who is a rich and beautiful woman who supports Jane to finish her schooling at Morton. Diana and Mary Rivers. They are Jane's cousin and St. John's sisters. Mrs. Fairfax, who is the housekeeper at Thornfield Hall. Grace Poole, who is a mysterious servant at Thornfield. Grace watches over Bertha Mason. Richard Mason, who is the timid brother of Bertha Mason. John Eyre, who is the uncle of Jane and St. John's River. He is a successful wine merchant. Uncle Reed, he adopts orphaned Jane and he promises his wife to take care of Jane as their own child. Mrs. Reed, who is Jane's aunt by marriage. John Reed, who is Mrs. Reed's son. Georgiana Reed, she is a spoiled daughter of Mrs. Reed. Eliza Reed, who is Mrs. Reed's third child. Bessie Lee, a house servant of Mrs. Reed. Mr. Lloyd, Mr. Brocklehurst, Maria Temple, Helen Burns, Miss Scathard, Miss Abbott, Mr. Briggs. The novel has a prologue. It starts with a prologue. The novel is published with the pseudonym Currer Bell. Bronte, she thanks the public and the publishers. Bronte, in the prologue section, she attacks the literary critics because those critics expect the authors to stick to stylistic and moral conventions. Bronte gives suggestion to the critics to accept the plain truth when it is revealed instead of clinging on to the appearances and beliefs that exist. She dedicates the novel to someone who she thinks brilliant. It is William Thackeray. William Thackeray is the Victorian satirist and the author of Vanity Fair. She praises Thackeray for being a social regenerator because in all his writing, he tries to correct the warped social system. Let us see the summary of Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre, she is an orphaned girl who lives with her aunt, Mrs. Reed, at Gateshead Hall. Mrs. Reed and her children, they treat Jane cruelly and they look down on her as a dependent human. Mrs. Reed punishes her for fighting with her cousin, but Jane did not fight with her cousin. Her aunt, Mrs. Reed, locks her in a red room where Jane's uncle, Mr. Reed, had died years before. In the room, Jane is terrified by the ghostly presence of her uncle. Days later, Mrs. Reed, she sends Jane to the Lowood institution, which is a charity school run by the hypocritical Mr. Brocklehurst. Lowood is a terrible place which has a harsh work ethic, but there was a compassionate supervisor called Maria Temple. She intervenes sometimes to give the children a break during their harsh work period. At Lowood, Jane tries to have friendship with another student named Helen Burns. Helen Burns tries to help Jane by teaching her personal traits. Jane also learns to endure personal injustice and also she tries to stick on to a benevolent God. Shortly, her friend Helen, she dies due to illness. As the school was in a bad condition, there was a typhus epidemic condition which schooled many children from the school. To this response, a new management takes over and improves Lowood's condition. Jane likes the new management and the new changes in her school. She flourishes under her newly considerate teachers and also becomes a teacher herself after 6 years. Miss Maria Temple, she marries and leaves Lowood, and the 18-year-old girl Jane, she advertises for a job as a private tutor. Looking at her advertisement, she is hired to become the governess of the young Adley Warrens. Adley Warren, she is a young French girl. Adley's mother was a dancer named Céline. Céline was Mr. Rochester's mistress and claimed that Adley was Mr. Rochester's daughter. Though he refuses to believe it, due to Selin's unfaithfulness and his lack of resemblance while looking adult. Mr. Rochester is an old commanding master of Thornfield Hall. While Jane is in Thornfield, she frequently hears strange laughter, and on one night she rescues Mr. Rochester from a fire in his bedroom. After Jane saves Mr. Rochester from the fire, he thanks her tenderly and emotionally. The next day, Rochester leaves unexpectedly. He moves to a distant party gathering, and after several days, he returns with the whole party, including the beautiful and talented Blanche Ingram. Jane then receives a letter from Mrs. Reed, who has suffered a stroke, and she called her. As Jane returns to Gateshead Hall, she remains there for a month in order to take care of her aunt. Mrs. Reed confesses to Jane that she has wronged her and punished her very rudely. She then gives her a letter which has come from Jane's paternal uncle, Mr. John Eyre. In the letter, John Eyre has called Jane Eyre to live with him and be his heir. Simultaneously, Mrs. Reed also dies, and Jane helps her cousins after the funeral before she returns to Thornfield. When Jane returns to Thornfield, she was surprised to meet Blanche Ingram, whom Mr. Rochester calls her as his fiancée. However, one midsummer evening, Rochester calls Jane and tells him that he will be missing her after he gets married. Jane, as she had some feelings over Rochester, she reveals her feelings for him. Mr. Rochester identifies that Jane is sincerely in love with him and he proposes marriage to Jane. At first, Jane is skeptical before she accepts his proposal. She then writes a letter to her uncle John telling him of her happy news. As Jane prepares for her wedding, she happened to meet a strange woman who has torn her wedding veil. During the wedding ceremony, Mr. Mason, a lawyer, he declared that Mr. Rochester cannot marry her because he is already married to Mr. Mason's sister named Bertha. At this time, Mr. Rochester admits that this is true, but he explains that his father tricked him into the marriage for her money. And at once after the wedding, he discovered Bertha to be mad and he eventually locked her away in Thornfield. He had also hired Grace Poole as Bertha's nurse to look after her. Once when Grace gets drunk, Rochester's wife, Bertha, she escapes and causes the strange happenings at Thornfield. Jane's uncle, Mr. John Eyre, is a friend of Mr. Mason. Soon after, he received the letter from Jane. And after the marriage ceremony is broken off, Mr. Rochester asks Jane to go with him to the south of France and live with him as husband and wife. Jane is now tempered and she loses her confidence because she doesn't want to get involved with the married man. Also, she wishes to stay true to her Christian values and beliefs. She refuses to go against her principles despite her love for Rochester. She then leaves Thornfield Hall at dawn before everyone could wake up. Jane travels so far from Thornfield Hall with the little money that she had saved previously. She was unaware where she was. She also experiences 3 bitter days of begging. She sleeps outside and was nearly starving. She was also unsuccessful in her attempts to trade her handkerchief and gloves for food. Eventually, she was taken to Moor House, which is the home of Mary, Diana, and St. John Rivers. St. John Rivers is a stern local clergyman. As she collapsed on the doorstep of their home, the clergyman St. John Rivers, Diana, and Mary, they rescued her. Few days later, after she regains her health, St. John find her a teaching position at a nearby village school. Jane also becomes good friends with John's sisters, Diana and Mary, but John stays aloof without interacting with all three. When the two sisters leave for governess jobs, St. John becomes slightly closer to Jane. Eventually, St. John learns the true identity of Jane and tells her that her uncle John Eyre has died and left her his entire fortune of £20,000. When Jane questions St. John of who revealed all these matters to St. John, he then says that John Eyre is also his uncle, but once St. John and his uncle was expecting a share of the inheritance, but they were left virtually nothing. Jane is overjoyed by finding that she had lived with her family members. She also insists on sharing the money equally with her cousins and calls Diana and Mary to be back at home at Moor House. St. John thinks that Jane will be his suitable missionary's wife. He then asks her to marry him and then they can go to India. Initially, Jane accepts going to India but rejects the marriage proposal. She suggests that they can travel as brother and sister. When Jane had planned to marry St. John, she weakens soon as she mystically hears Mr. Rochester's voice calling her name. Jane now returns to Tromfield to see if Rochester is all right. There she finds that he has made Fairfax to retire and Adele to school soon as Jane had departed from Tromfield. Followed to this, his wife Bertha had set the house on fire and died by jumping from the roof. And while saving the servants and attempting to rescue his wife, Rochester has lost a hand and his eyesight. Now Jane reunites with Rochester. Rochester is overjoyed at her return, but soon fears that she may leave him for his condition. Rochester now had become a humbled man. He owes to live a pure life and reveals that he has intensely pined for Jane ever since she left. He also says that he even called out her name in despair one night. So this was the very call that she heard at Moor House. To all this, Jane responds saying that she is now financially independent woman and assures him of her love. She declares that she will never leave him. Rochester again proposes her and they are married. They now begin their life blissfully in an old wood house called Friendly Manor. The couple also stay in touch with Adele as she grows up, as well as they stay connected with Diana and Mary. Diana and Mary also gets a loving husband. She learns that St. John moves to India to accomplish his missionary goals, but soon he has become gravely ill. As days pass, Rochester regains sight in his one eye. That was approximately 2 years after their wedding, and his eyesight enabled him to see their newborn son. Let us see the themes of this novel: love, family, and independence. So, as an orphaned girl, Jane, she's oppressed and dependent. For Jane, she wants to discover herself, though she lived in a restrictive environment. In her later life, she finds love and independence, social class and social rules. So life in 19th century in Britain, it was governed by social class and people typically stayed in the class into which they were born. But Jane, she breaks off all the class structure of Britain because she indulged with many different people. She moves to Gateshead, she moves to Tromfield, and interacts with people all around, especially communicates with working class, servants, aristocrats. Next is gender roles. Gender roles. Jane's behavior and attitude were independent. She was intelligent, and finds a place to show up her individuality. In the novel, too, she was recognized for her personal qualities. Next is religion. Jane learns to follow Christian lessons and resists temptation. It was Jane's friend Helen Burns introduces Jane to the New Testament, after which Jane tries to keep it as a moral guide spot for continuing her life. The last is spiritual and supernatural. Here, Bronte uses themes of Gati. At first, when Mr. Rhys keeps Jane inside a red room, Jane is frightened of as if she's listening to her uncle's voice. So, in this particular portion, Bronte has showed spiritual and supernatural elements. Hope this video helps. If you have query, please write it down on the comment section. Thank you for listening.